welcome back to chapter 19 of Momo. It's getting really tense and exciting at the moment, and only last 3 chapters left. Really exciting. I hope wherever you are, things are going okay, and this is my way of trying to link to people to bring some comfort. Are you sitting comfortably?
Yep.
Great. For those that aren't sitting comfortably and who don't feel like they can get comfortable after doing the best they can, then hopefully this will bring you some comfort. Let's see how it goes. A gentle voice was speaking. Momo emerged by degrees from the depths of a dreamless sleep, feeling wonderfully rested and refreshed. Momo isn't to blame, she heard the voice say, but you, Cassiopeia, you should have known better. Momo opened her eyes. Professor Horror was sitting at the little table in front of the sofa, looking ruefully down at the toys. Didn't it occur to you, he went on, that the men in grey might follow you? There wasn't room on Cassiopeia's shelf for all she had to say, so she had to rely on 3 installments. I can only see half an hour ahead. Too late by then. Professor Horror sighed and shook his head. Oh, Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia, even I find you puzzling sometimes. Momo sat up. Ah, our guest is awake, Professor Horror said kindly. I hope you're feeling better. Much better, thank you, said Momo. Please excuse me for falling asleep on your sofa. The professor smiled. It's quite all right. You've no need to apologise. Cassiopeia has already brought me up to date on everything I failed to see through my omnivision glasses. What are the men in grey doing? Momo asked anxiously. Professor Horror produced a big blue handkerchief from his pocket. We're under siege. They have us completely surrounded. That's to say, they're as close to Nowhere House as they can get. But they can't get in, can they? Momo said. The professor blew his nose. No, they can't. You saw for yourself they vanish into thin air if they so much as set foot in Neverlane. Momo looked mystified. Yes, but I don't know why. It's temporal suction that does it, the professor told her. Everything has to be done backwards in Neverlane, as you know. Because time runs in reverse around the house, normally time flows into you. The more time you have inside you, the older you get. But in Neverlane, time flows out of you. You grew younger while you were coming up the lane. Not much younger, only as much younger as the time it took to get from one end to the other. I didn't notice anything, Momo said, still mystified. That's because you're a human being, the professor said with a smile. There's a lot more to human beings than the men in grey. There's a lot more to human beings than the time they carry around inside them. But it's different with the men in grey. Stolen time is all they consist of, and that disappears in a flash when they're exposed to temporal suction. It escapes like air from a burst balloon. The only difference being that a balloon skin survives. In their case, there's nothing left at all. Momo knit her brows and thought hard. Wouldn't it be possible, she asked at length, to make time run backwards all over the world? Only for a little while, I mean. It wouldn't matter if people grew a tiny bit younger, but the time thieves would be reduced to nothing. The professor smiled again. A splendid idea, I grant you, but I'm afraid it wouldn't work. The 2 currents are in balance, you see. If you cancelled one, the other would vanish too. Then there'd be no time left. He broke off and pushed his omnivision glasses up so that they rested on his forehead. On the other hand, he murmured. Momo watched him expectantly as he paced up and down the room a few times, lost in thought, and Cassiopeia followed him with her wise eyes. At length he sat down. You've given me an idea, he said, but I couldn't put it into practice unaided. He looked down at the toys. Cassiopeia, my dear, I'd like your opinion on something. What's the best thing to do when you're under siege? Have breakfast, came the reply. Quite so, said the professor. That's another splendid idea. The table was laid in a flash. Whether or not it had been laid all the time and Momo simply hadn't noticed, everything was in place. The 2 little cups, the pot of steaming chocolate, the honey, butter and crusty rolls. Momo, whose mouth had often watered at recollection of her first delicious golden-hued breakfast at Nowhere House, tucked in at once. Everything tasted even better than before, if possible, and this time the professor tucked in heartily too. Professor, Momo said after a while, with her cheeks still bulging, they want you to give them all the time that exists. You won't, though, will you? No, child, he replied. That'll never do. Time will come to an end some day, but not until people don't need it any longer. The men in grey won't get any time from me, not even a split second. But they say they can make you hand it over, Momo said. Before we go into that, the professor told her, very gravely, I'd like you to look at them for yourself. For yourself. I think we need the glasses for this bit. All she saw to begin with was the kaleidoscope of colours and shapes that had made her so dizzy the first time. But it wasn't long before her eyes got used to the Omnivision lenses. These ones. And then the besieging army swam into focus. The men in grey were drawn up in a long, long line, shoulder to shoulder, not only across the mouth of Never Lane, but all around the district, with the snow-white houses. They formed an unbroken cordon, and the midpoint of that cordon was Nowhere House. But then Momo noticed something else, something strange. Her first thought was that the lenses of the Omnivision glasses needed polishing, or that she hadn't quite grown used to them yet, because the outlines of the men in grey looked misty. She soon realised that this blurring had nothing to do with the lenses or her eyes. The mist was real, and it was rising from the streets all around, dense and impenetrable in some places, only just forming in others. The men in grey were standing absolutely still, all wearing bowlers and carrying briefcases, and all smoking little grey cigars. But the smoke from the cigars didn't disperse in the normal way. Here, where the air seemed made of glass and never disturbed by a breath of wind, the threads of smoke clung like cobwebs, creeping along the streets and up the walls of the snow-white houses, festooning each ledge and cornice and window-sill, condensing into a noisome bluish-green fog bank that billowed ever higher until it encircled Nowhere House like a wall. Momo took off the glasses and looked at Professor Hora inquiringly. Have you seen enough? He asked. Then let me have the glasses back. He put them on again. You asked if the men in grey could make me do something against my will, he went on. Well, they can't get at me personally, as you know, as you know, but they could subject the world to an evil far worse than any they've inflicted on it so far. That's how they hope to force my hand. Momo was appalled. What could be worse than stealing people's time, she asked. I allot people their share of time, the professor explained. The men in grey can't stop that. They can't intercept the time I distribute, but they can poison it. They poison it. They can poison it, Momo repeated, more appalled still. The professor nodded. Yes, with the smoke from their cigars. Have you ever seen one of them without his little grey cigar? Of course not, because without it he couldn't exist. What kind of cigars are they? Momo asked. You remember where the hour lilies were growing, Professor Hora said. I told you then that everyone has a place like that because everyone has a heart. If people allow the men in grey to gain a foothold there, more and more of their hour lilies get stolen. But hour lilies plucked from a person's heart can't die because they never really withered. They can't live either because they've been parted from their rightful owner. They strive with every fibre of their being to return to the person they belong to. Momo was listening with bated breath. If you think I know everything, Momo, you're wrong. Some evils are wrapped in mystery. I've no idea why the men in grey keep their stolen hour lilies. I only know that they preserve the blossoms by freezing them till they're as hard as glass goblets. Somewhere deep underground there must be a gigantic cold store. Momo's cheeks began to burn with indignation. And that's where the men in grey draw their supplies from. They pull off the hour lily's petals, let them wither till they're dried up and grey, and roll their little cigars out of them. The petals still contain remnants of life, even then, but the living time is harmful to the men in grey, so they light the cigars and smoke them. Only when time has been converted into smoke is it well and truly dead. That's what keeps the men in grey alive, dead human time. Momo had risen to her feet. Oh, she exclaimed, to think of all those poor flowers, all that dead time. Yes, the wall they're erecting around the house is built of dead time. There's still enough open sky above for me to send people their time in good condition, but once that pall of smoke closes over our heads, every hour I send them will be contaminated with the time thieves' poison. When they absorb it, it'll make them ill. Momo stared at the professor uncomprehendingly. What kind of an illness is it? She asked in a low voice. A fatal illness. Though you scarcely notice it at first. One day you feel one day you don't feel like doing anything. Nothing interests you. Everything bores you. Far from wearing off, your boredom persists and gets worse day by day and week by week. You feel more and more bad-tempered, more and more empty inside, more and more dissatisfied with yourself and the world in general. Then, even that feeling wears off, and you don't feel like anything anymore. You become completely indifferent to what goes on around you. Joy and sorrow, anger and excitement are things of the past. You forget how to laugh and cry. You're cold inside and incapable of loving anything or anyone. Once you reach that stage, the disease is incurable. There's no going back. You bustle around with a blank grey face, just like the men in grey themselves. Indeed, you've joined their ranks. The disease has a name. It's called deadly tedium. Momo shivered. You mean, she said, unless you hand over all the time they'll turn people into creatures like themselves? Yes, the professor replied. That's how they hope to bully me into it. He rose and turned away. I've waited till now for people to get rid of those pests. They could have done it. After all, It was they who brought them into existence in the first place. But I can't wait any longer. I must do something, and I can't do it on my own. He looked Momo in the eye. Will you help me? Yes, she whispered. If you do, you'll be running an incalculable risk. It will be up to you whether the world begins to live again or stands still forever and a day. Are you really prepared to take that risk? Yes, Momo repeated, and this time her voice was firm. In that case, said the professor, listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you, because you'll be all on your own. I won't be able to help you, nor will anybody else. Momo nodded, gazing at him intently. I must begin by telling you that I never sleep, he said. If I dozed off, the world would stand still and the world would come to a stop. If there were no more time, the men in grey would have none left to steal. They could continue to exist for a while by using up their vast reserves, but once they had gone, they would dissolve into thin air. Then the answer is simply, surely, said Momo. Not as simple as it sounds, I'm afraid, or I wouldn't need your help. The trouble is, if there were no more time, I couldn't wake up again, and the world would continue to stand still for all eternity. It does, however, lie within my power to give you, and you alone, 1 hour, Lily. Only one, of course, because only one ever blossoms at a time. So if time stopped all over the world, you would still have 1 hour's grace. Then I could wake you, said Momo. The professor shook his head. That would achieve nothing, because the men in grey have far too much time in reserve. They would consume very little of it in an hour, so they'd still be there when the hour was up. No, Momo, the problem is a great deal harder than that. As soon as the men in grey notice that time has stopped, and it won't take them long because their supply of cigars will be interrupted, they'll lift the siege and head for their secret store. You must follow them and prevent them from reaching it. When their cigars are finished, they'll be finished too. But then comes what may well turn out to be the hardest part of all. Once the last of the time thieves has vanished, you must release every stolen minute, because only when people get their time back will I wake up and the world come to life again. And all this you'll have to do within the space of a single hour. Momo hadn't reckoned on such a host of difficulties and dangers. She stared at him hopelessly. Will you try all the same? The professor asked. It's our only chance. Momo couldn't bring herself to speak. She found the prospect so daunting. At that moment, Cassiopeia's shell lit up. I'll come too, it signalled. Unlikely as it seemed that the toys could be of help, the words conjured up a tiny ray of hope. Momo felt heartened at the thought of not being entirely alone. Although there were no rational grounds for such a feeling, it did at least enable her to make up her mind. I'll try, she said resolutely. Professor Horror gave her a long look and started to smile. Many things will prove easier than you think. You've heard the music of the stars. You mustn't feel frightened. He turned to the toys. So you want to go too, do you? Of course, Cassiopeia spelled out. Then someone has to look after her. The professor and Momo smiled at each other. Will she get an hour lily too? Momo asked. She doesn't need one, the professor replied. gently tickling the tortoise's neck. Cassiopeia is a creature from beyond the frontiers of time. She carries her own little supply of time inside her. She could go on crawling across the face of the earth, even if everything else stood still forever. Good, Momo suddenly eager to get on with the job. What happens next? Now, said the professor, we say goodbye. Momo felt a lump in her throat. Won't we ever see each other again? She said softly. Of course we will, he told her, and until that day comes, every hour of your life will bring you my love. We'll always be friends, won't we? Momo nodded. I'm going now, the professor went on, but you mustn't follow me or ask where I'm going. My sleep is no ordinary sleep, and I'd sooner you weren't there. One last thing. As soon as I'm gone, you must open both doors. The little one with my name on it, and the big bronze one that leads into Never Lane. Once time is stopped, everything will stand still, and no power on earth will be able to budge those doors. Have you understood and memorized all I've told you? Yes, said Momo, but how shall I know when time has stopped? You'll know, no fear. They both stood up. Professor Hora gently stroked Momo's tousled mop of hair. Goodbye, Momo, he said, and thank you for listening so carefully. I'm going to tell everyone about you, she replied. When it's all over. From one moment to the next, Professor Hora looked as old as he had when he carried her into the Golden Dome, as old as an ancient tree or primeval crag. Turning away, he walked swiftly out of the little room, whose walls consisted of grandfather clocks. Momo heard his footsteps fade until they were indistinguishable from the ticking of the countless clocks around her. Their incessant whirring and ticking and chiming seemed to have swallowed him up. Momo took Cassiopeia in her arms and held her tight. Her great adventure had begun. There could be no turning back. Dun, dun, dun. Only 2 chapters left. So join me again very soon for chapter 20. Hope you're enjoying. Here goes.